Welcome to Parents at Work, a podcast for people who want to succeed and thrive at work while they have kids. This podcast is sponsored by the Spiegel Law Firm, a firm that empowers people who've been wrongfully fired or are afraid that they might be. I am Tom Spiegel, and joining me today is my co-host, Lori Mahalik-Levin, an attorney and founder of the online platform Mindful Return. Lori, I'll turn it over to you to tell us more about Mindful Return and to introduce our guest today.
Wonderful, Tom. Thanks so much. This is Lori Mahalik-Levin. I founded a program called Mindful Return that helps new parents transition back to work after parental leave and that helps employers to retain their new parent top talent. On this podcast, as you might know, we pick a different industry or sector and then interview moms and dads in that particular field. And we've already released an episode of moms who are in the mental health field. And today we're happy to transition over to the dad side of that space. I think particularly during this pandemic, mental health is such an important topic. And so we're really excited to be able to speak with a mental health professional today who is himself a parent. Robin Smith, our guest today, is a licensed marriage and family therapist in clinical practice in Bethesda, Maryland. As an MFT, he specializes in relationship issues for couples, families, and individuals for improved quality of life. His areas of expertise include transition to parenthood for new and expecting parents, infidelity, sex and intimacy issues, premarital counseling, and trauma. Other passions of his include writing, recording and performing music, podcasting, and rooting on the 2018 Stanley Cup champions, the Washington Capitals. And of course, he enjoys spending quality time with his wife and his two daughters who are now 4 and 2. Welcome to the podcast, Robin. It's really good to have you here.
Thanks, Lori. Thanks, Tom, for having me on.
Absolutely. So, Robin, we usually kick off our podcast by asking our guests to tell a little bit about their own personal working parent story. So I'd love to hear that story. And I would also love to hear what working dad health in a mental health field life looks like during COVID right now as well, because I know that is a totally different scene.
Yeah. Well, my story as a working dad really is centered around, at least the way I tell it to myself, is centered around being split in 3 different locations. You know, I graduated from the University of Maryland's couple and family therapy program and was found placement at a high school wellness center in Silver Spring. And so I was working there with high schoolers doing therapy, you know, in the middle of the school day, pulling kids from classes and doing counseling and family counseling after school. I was working in private practice in Bowie at a small group practice. And then I was also starting my own private practice in Silver Spring, you know, subleasing office space and just starting out, you know. And my wife and I found out that we were going to have a child and we're really excited. And so I knew that I needed to sort of collapse. I can't be commuting to all these different locations. And ultimately my goal is to be, 100% in private practice. So sort of started that process. I took a month off when our first daughter was born. And I said this earlier, like every clinician, it's a personal choice how much time, for everyone that they can, if they can take off work. I'm fortunate enough that where I could take off work, but taking off work when you have clients, patients who are, used to coming in for counseling sessions weekly, it's a sort of an important decision to make on how much time you take off and what's the plan for if they need to reach out. Are you going to be available, or do you have another colleague or associate to help, step in and fill in for those needs? So I took a month off for our first daughter, took a month off for our second daughter. And I was saying earlier how I wish that we lived in a society where we could, take off more time because, as there's a lot of development that happens, and it's so important to, in those first months, those first 3 years, actually 2.5 to 3 years, so much development that it's spending quality time with your child is the highest cost, the highest value, the highest use of your time, at least speaking for myself anyway.
One day, Robin, I foresee a future where we will have paid parental leave, at least by the time my children have babies, I hope. Yeah. Oh, I'm hopeful of that future as well. Sorry, just one thing we were talking about prior to recording was about the fact that, as a man, you're not showing, right? There's no bump. So your clients don't know that a baby's coming. So, well, how do you navigate that?
Yeah, exactly. So there's, for my women colleagues who are expecting, they have to have that conversation earlier. I got to delay it until, I didn't really delay it. Honestly, I wanted to give my folks a good heads up. I probably let them know with 2 or 3 months advance notice. But yeah, it's interesting too, because sometimes that's a clinical issue. I could be working with a couple who's having fertility issues, right? In fact, not could be. This was not, this might've been for the second pregnancy where, for our youngest daughter, I was working with a couple, they were experiencing fertility issues. And the fact that I had to interrupt the work and leave because I myself was successful in that area was hard. It was hard. The couple actually ended up terminating, they're exiting. And, who knows really what the reason was, but I suspect it could have been that, So,
and it's just one of the realities of life, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And then for, the transition to COVID, also a lot of my colleagues, I'm so grateful that my home is actually well suited to continue working virtually, despite the fact that I have 2 rambunctious girls, So I have an office. I have doors to that office that close. I have a white noise machine and a hanging tag on the door. And the old adage of catch them being good, reinforce when they're doing the right thing. It's like, right. I would make it a point to just go out of my way, go out, my daughter's drawing with chalk on the driveway. I go out and just say, hey, sweetie, I'm so glad you're doing such a great job, not opening the door when daddy's in session, when that hanging tag means you can't open it up. And so there's not really, I don't share the same experience with some horror stories with some of my other colleagues where they, there's obviously with counseling, there's a privacy element to it. And so when there's disruption in the frame and the setting, and it's challenging. So one of my colleagues is actually like, well, when can we get back in the office? Because and it's like, don't get the wrong idea, guys. No one's coming in. I don't want to meet patients in the office, but I want to go into the office so I have some privacy and some stability, some security here. So right. I'm very grateful that the environment is engineered in a way for success. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say that's such a wonderful reminder to keep reinforcing the positive with our kids. And, we've noticed that carrots are so much more helpful than sticks. And, I was having a conversation yesterday with a friend who's, I've known her since law school. And she said, her daughter came up to her and said, Mommy, did you notice that I didn't interrupt you during your call? And she said, yes, thank you so much. And she goes, Mommy, I did that because I know you need to work to earn money and I really want you to buy me that baby doll. So they're starting to understand the connection here. Yeah. Right. Wonderful. If you sort of zoom out to the mental health profession and, think about pre-COVID as well, what would you say it's like to be a dad in the mental health field these days?
Yeah, I honestly don't know how to answer that question because, there's a large part of me that's very cautious about speaking to such a broad population. The diversity of experiences is probably so great, that I'm really hesitant or cautious to make assumptions about what it's like or to speak so broadly. But I guess just from my own personal experience, well, let me back up, right? Because the single dad or the blended family's dad, or the dad who has kids who are in their 30s, but is now, with another partner and has a baby, these dads who all may be mental health professionals are going to have different experiences, but maybe something that kind of cuts across and that's general is kind of what's true among many professions, which is work-life balance. Although maybe the mental health professional is much more intimately aware of the costs or the payoffs to setting appropriate boundaries. So you might be in finance, you might be in law, you might be whatever your industry is, and that so-and-so is bringing their work home with them or they're working weekends. And you kind of know in the back of your head, this is, I just got to do it, got to keep my shoulder to the wheel but mental health professionals are, very aware that part of their work is like, we ought to know what self-care practices are. Right. And so, so therefore dads who are committed to their profession and they want to make time and know their own limits to how many people they can see a day and all of that, and also not bringing their work home with them. Our dads need to be aware of striking that right balance. So, that's a very, general answer, but perhaps something else might pop in as we talk.
Robin, I can imagine that the work that you do specifically because you focus on issues that are similar to what you're probably grappling with yourself in working parenthood, that some of your clinical work informs and it gives you pause and informs how you're thinking about your parenting, for example, and vice versa. Is there any specific example or thing that comes to mind along those fronts?
Well, I mean, I'll tell you, the first thing that comes to mind, it's a good point that you raise. The first thing that comes to my mind is take 10 different professions and parents who are judging themselves on how good of a job they're doing or poor of a job, or how preoccupied or focused. Am I spending enough time with my kids? Am I saying the right things? Was I too hard on them, in terms of like a consequence or something? There's, if your specialization is working with kids, if you do play therapy, or if you're, let's say you're a developmental psychologist, you have intimate knowledge on what is healthy and unhealthy. And so when you find yourself in times of stress, as we all do, since we're human, our shared human experience is that none of us are perfect and that we have flaws. And so I don't know. I think that perhaps, I can speak for myself certainly, but perhaps this is true for others, that the mental health professionals who work with kids and work with families and know what's healthy, we might be more prone to feeling shame or feeling harder on ourselves because it's like, we know what's right. We ought to be able to practice what we preach, So I know that for myself, kind of like variants of perfectionism aside, my standards, like when I lose my temper, for example, or when I'm stressed out, or when I make a sacrifice that I tell myself, yeah, I really got to do this work. And so therefore the opportunity cost is I won't be able to do bedtime routine tonight. Sometimes I do kind of catch myself and say like, wait a minute, you're not practicing what you preach. There's like, there's a very compelling storyline that says you need to get this thing out or you need to do this, but like, consider what's being sacrificed. As we all know, all of us parents know that it goes by so fast, the development happens so quickly. So yeah, I'm kind of rambling now, but I wonder if you take my point.
Oh, absolutely. And I can completely relate to it. I mean, I work with tons of working parents around issues such as working parent guilt. And, I'm like, well, I can sit here and feel guilty and beat myself up for feeling guilty because I've taught people how not to feel guilty. So yes, I totally get that. Yeah. Over to you, Tom.
Great. Thanks so much, Lori. Good stuff, Robin. And, as I'm listening to you guys talk, it just reminds me how much all this has changed pre and post COVID, just the conversation about, where we're all working now and, knock on wood, we'll get COVID under control and we'll go back to being something different, but I don't know that we'll ever go back to exactly like it was before. And, it'll be interesting to see just what, what history says about this chapter and all the, it's great to be home with the family. And when it's just interesting, I think about my own experience and what my kids are seeing. And they're just, they were always, because, my wife and I are, as we all are here, white collar professionals, used to seeing kind of what we did, but not as intimately as they do now. And I don't know about you, but like, we now have like, our kids know like which calls they can be in the room for and which they can't.
Right.
Right? Is this and my wife too. I mean, like, is this like a real call or is this like just a, sort of in-house call that you don't mind if people are running around in? So and that's just one of the many kinds of, changes that we've dealt with working at home, but which kind of dovetails into my question for you, Robin, which again will be sort of different pre and post COVID. And for you, I think you can answer this both from your perspective from being an employee and then later, as you kind of transition to, having your own practice. And that is, what workplace supports did you find particularly helpful as you became a working parent?
Yeah. So I don't feel that there were like an absence of support or a presence of support. In other words, like I said, when I transitioned to becoming a father, I was collapsing my 2 workplace locations 3 into 1. And so it's not as if I had an office manager I think at that time I was still a licensed graduate marriage and family therapist. So, I have a supervisor, but like that stuff gets scheduled on my, when it works for everyone. So there's so much flexibility of when I'm working that, just frankly, I don't even think about what support did I have professionally? I could have maybe other therapists who are also, new time parents, but I didn't have there wasn't a professional structure in place really at all, being self-employed. And, so it might be different if I worked in an organization that was really large and had something, but honestly, I don't even know what that looks like. Because when I became a dad, I'm self-employed, employee of one, and set my own hours and own schedule. So, my support really just came from personal circles, friends and family. There was something that you said a moment ago, Tom, that I wanted to just comment on real quick, which was which calls are okay. When I'm in session, I'll hang the tag. And then when I'm not in session, I won't, but I'll be good about that. Meaning my girls now know when I don't see that tag, I can knock,
yeah.
And they always know if there's an emergency, you can come in anytime, when they know kind of to the extent that a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old can define what an emergency is. So mommy is doing a lot of interference, she's running defense. But you also said something that I wanted to comment on. You didn't say silver lining necessarily, at least I don't remember you did, but it made me, something you said about, spending more time together. And really and I know I'm not alone here, I can't tell you how important and grateful I am that I get to be at more family dinners, because my, couple and family therapy, kids, are in school. And so a lot of sessions are happening in afternoons and evenings. And so when I'm in Bethesda, and my family, we live in Silver Spring and, northern, we're not really in Silver Spring, but technically the zip code says we are. So there's a long commute. And so I was not getting to participate in a lot of family dinners. And now that I wrap up my notes, I'm done session and I leave the office and now I'm home. So I can participate in more family dinners, which has just been the most, without question, the highest silver lining in all of this for me.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It is certainly an upside. I mean, a lot of those, interstitial spaces when you're at work, your kids aren't around. And so you're not spending, when you're away from the home, at least you're not spending the time with the kids. And now when you're at home, you can just pop in and talk with them, or they're sitting beside you anyway. And so you can kind of, look over at the drawing or whatever it may be. It's, there's a tremendous upside to it too. Well, that following question, which again, now is going to be different pre and post COVID, but I'll, put your kind of thinking cap on here. Are there any workplace supports, again, still given your ability to control your schedule, but are there any workplace supports that you did not have as you became a working parent that you wish you did, or that you hope that people coming behind you will have?
The first thing that pops into my head is, and it probably did exist and I just didn't go looking for it. Honestly, the thing that pops into my head is new dad groups. So, and not just new dad groups, we're all different sectors, but, new dad groups who are therapists. I mean, I get asked all the time by people, do you take my insurance? And we're really looking for a male who can work with families, who is in network. And it's you're a unicorn, And so I mean, really, when I find other guys out there and I'm I'm adding you to my provider, my quote unquote Rolodex, my provider network, because, we need to know about one another to refer out, because there's not a lot of us. And so, I mean, I say that because what does that look like in the state of Maryland? How many new dad therapists are experiencing the transition to fatherhood right now in the state of Maryland? I don't know what that number is, but how do they know about one another? Is there, kind of an offshoot of a listserv? So that's what I think about in terms of if I could do it all over again, that would be helpful. I didn't reach out though. I didn't reach out for that, but I felt that I was getting a lot of support personally. But, and also, frankly, being male or female didn't matter as much as being a therapist. So just being a new parent and being able to talk with other, therapists and counselors who had recently gone through the transition. So I did have colleagues who had recently done it and who also were going through it kind of with me. I remember one of my colleagues who worked at the wellness center, we followed the same timeline. We kind of got married in the same month on the same year, when we both became parents around the same time, and we were just kind of on the same track. And so I also had her to kind of talk to. But that's what I think about. Is there a group of mental health professionals who are new parents? Does that group exist? I have no idea, but that would be really, swell to have. And you might even need to broaden it outside of Maryland. You might not just have like the DMV area. If we want to get specific around dad issues, specifically, what is it like to, become a father and experience your partner, postpartum depression or unintentionally gatekeeping and saying, oh no, I'm the only one who really knows how to get this baby down. And so I know in a lot of heterosexual couples, that can be the case where dads, they kind of know their role, but they also feel a little bit like, if I'm not being invited to the party, I don't know how to get in there and be active. And sometimes, like I said, moms will, not intentionally at all, there's no malice here, but moms will act as sort of gatekeepers. They're the ones who are waking up in the middle of the night or breastfeeding, or they're the ones who know how to mix the formula. They're the ones who know what appropriate care looks like. And rather than trusting their partner or helping them cooperate and teach them, they kind of just like, let me just do it myself, So there are specific dad's issues that could be helpful for such a group to exist. And again, maybe one does. I don't know of it.
Yeah, well, on this, I'm going to hand it over to Lori because this would be a perfect opportunity to talk about mindful return. But just before I do that, it also occurs to me, which I think those are great points, Robin, like also how just the different life stages are, because, there is having kids when you're sort of like, newborn through toddler, and then there's sort of a, toddler to preteen, and the needs sort of vary. I'm just thinking about myself as my kids, my youngest now is 7. So we're sort of, well past the diaper stage, fortunately, well past the waking up at night. But, our oldest is 14 and, we're entering those teenage, issues. And there's just how, yes, parent groups, absolutely, but also maybe even more segmented than that, because, the kind of the, other dads that I would want to talk to is like, okay, how are you handling like
your teen
thriving? Yes, exactly. And social media and all those things, we're sort of out of the diaper, out of the diaper stage and those particular needs. And also to your point about, dads trying to, not so much not being invited to the party, but how these kind of barriers spring up without even being noticed. I remember with our first child, my wife, she's lucky to have maternity leave and she stayed home. And I remember we got into an argument about like household chores and things like that. And I forget the exact details, except I remember her saying, look, it would be really helpful if you, and I considered myself a very active parent. Like I was not one who's like, hey, it's your job to do this. I was trying to be helpful, but she said, it would be really helpful if you would just help me wash out the baby bottles. And I just hadn't been doing it. And just because she had been doing it, she'd been one doing the breastfeeding, and it just kind of organically sprang up that way. And once she showed me what was involved in like getting those baby bottles like ready to go, I was like, wow, this is a lot of work.
This is a system.
I'm like, I had no idea, and here I was living in the same house, going through the same things. And so it's sort of those things that sort of spring up unless you're mindful of them, that, kind of do act as, I think, as barriers sometimes from fathers or other partners getting involved. And with that, Lori, I will turn over to you to talk a little bit about mindful return and the kind of the work you're doing in this exact space, and then going on to your questions.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Yeah, I would love to mention that Mindful Return started off as a 4-week online cohort-based course for new moms who are returning to work after maternity leave. And then about 2 years into, working on this project, and as employers started offering the program to their new moms, they came back and said, hey, we want to be able to offer a gender neutral benefit. And I said, yes, you do. And so I collaborated with this awesome dad named Jeremy Smith, who took 2 extended paternity leaves from Bank of America to create the working dad version of the Mindful Return course. So for the past several years now, we've been running cohorts every other month of dads from all over the country in all different industries and sectors who are trying to figure out how to normalize taking of paternity leave in our society, and also, what it means to transition to working fatherhood and how to navigate all those different pieces. So just want to throw out there that there are communities forming. I also, at my employer, at the law firm where I work, founded a couple of years ago a working parent group, and we started having brown bag lunches and things like that. And some of the dads who came said, oh my gosh, like you moms have all these groups, but I don't have anything where I can talk about this stuff,
Right.
So I think there's definitely a need there. I also just wanted to tell one quick story. You were talking about kids determining when it's okay to enter and not. And yesterday I was about to, lead a webinar that I really, really didn't want to be disturbed on. And my 7-year-old, my youngest, said, but mommy, what if there's a cobra in the basement? Which, we're trying to define what's an emergency and what isn't. And I said, well, your dad will be with you, so you can tell him to call animal control. He's like, but if there's a cobra. Anyway, so we're imagining all sorts of scenarios that we previously would never have thought about.
Right.
Anyway, so my next question for you, Robin, is if you can look at the mental health profession broadly, what changes do you think are happening in the field, in the profession, that are affecting working parents? And if I could just pause and say, one of my personal questions is, so is teletherapy here to stay forever? Are people ever going to go back into the office?
Yeah.
But then beyond that, are there other broader global changes that you see affecting folks who practice in mental health, who are parents?
Yeah. Well, honestly, I don't know that I can speak to the specific changes in the mental health field that affect parents per se. But, as soon as you asked that sub question about telehealth, it's well, that's one of the biggies that they're going through here, is that there were providers, plenty really, who had 100% online practices. They were only virtual, and they were well prepared for this adjustment when we all went virtual. But now, obviously, because of safety and necessity, pretty much all therapists, that I know of, I was asked by someone, is anyone meeting in the office? And I was kind of just saying well, no, no one that I know of. I have not heard any colleague who has been so bold as to get their practice up and running and have face shields and are doing, play therapy, sand tray with, little kids in person. I don't know of anyone who's doing that. Now, maybe there are in other states across the United States, but and certainly in the rest of the world. But in our community, we're all digital as far as I know, and that's been hard for therapists who are of a different generation. Who they don't even whether you did video therapy or not. Maybe your practice had online electronic health records and you sign paperwork digitally. Then you have therapists who are very old school, and it's paper notes and it's paper forms and it's paper everything, and it's in person. So those therapists I think probably had the hardest time making the adjustment, because you can't have, what are you going to do? You're going to mail the forms and then have them mail them back? It's no, there's plenty of technological solutions to those things. So, the adjustment for getting up and running, one of my mentors flat out, I was going to help her. I was tag teaming with one of my fellow graduates of the University of Maryland in the couple of family therapy program. We were helping her, okay, here's the PDF, here's how you do Zoom, basically.
Right.
And eventually, we had a scheduled call to help her. And on her call, she was like, Robin, I don't want to waste your time. I'm just not going to change. I'm not going to do this. If people want to meet with me, they can come out on my back deck, So you have variants of adaptation, but doing telehealth as a counselor, it's like I said, there are experiences in session that require materials that you don't, maybe your average client will have a pen and crayons and, paper, but you can't expect them to have a sand tray with little miniature figurines, you can't. And there's something called a family sculpt, where you have a family in the room, and one of the family members is the one who chooses which event they're going to reenact, an event that's really bothering them and that they can't get past. And so they sort of take their family members and, let's say it's in the kitchen, and here's what dad looks like, and here's what my sibling looks like, and here's what mom's. And that's really hard. I don't know if that's happening at all. So certain techniques are just, I imagine, can't be implemented in this medium, or if they are, it takes a really creative, clinician. So it's just I've been very aware of some of the limitations of this modality. And also I say to my clients, it's the value here, it's you're going to pay the same amount. Your insurance company is going to, the contracted rate doesn't change, but the value, in my opinion, the value is slightly less. We can't make eye contact with one another. you know, and that's, I mean, this is a human helping profession. So eye contact's important. But one of the things, you know, because you're either looking at the monitor or you're looking in the camera, so you can't meet someone's gaze. But one of the interesting things that I've found is everyone had poor expectations, low expectations about the quality. And so both on both sides, the provider and the patient, everyone's saying, yeah, it's good. It's a lot better than I thought it was going to be. You know, it is. And that is true. I mean, across the board, that's what I hear from colleagues and from clients. So it's the fact that it's like, well, this is still worth doing, you know, and we can pretty much sustain this until whenever we're through the pandemic. So in terms of like, is it here to stay? I think maybe you guys have been hearing about in all sectors, sort of COVID essentially hit the accelerator on things that would have happened a couple of years from now, 5 years from now. They have, you know, industries have to adjust. And so when we get to a post-COVID on the other side of this, what will it look like? Well, what will it look like in my field? I imagine there will be both consumers of therapy and practitioners, providers of therapy, who are maybe less likely to see the need of having to like find someone who's close to their work office or their home office and say like, actually, I found someone who's a really good fit and they're in Southern Maryland. And the video format is just fine. It's very convenient. You know, I don't have to find parking. And so I think that's probably going to happen, but you know, I'm not a futurist. My father-in-law is, I'm not a futurist. I don't really know, but that's my guess, is that we will see more video therapy and people, you know, who will opt for it. And then you'll have purists who are just, again, kind of can't wait to get back, both providers and consumers of therapy, can't wait to get back in the room with a person. You know, the way we've been relating to each other for thousands of years, you know, that needs to return.
Right. No, thank you for that really helpful and thoughtful answer. I think you've also imparted an important piece of advice here, which is particularly in COVID, we should set all of our expectations incredibly low, and then we'll meet them day after day.
Right.
Back over to you, Tom.
All right, great. Yeah, you know, in our firm, we were at least a lot remote before. I mean, we have a brick and mortar space, you know, but because a lot of our attorneys are easily an hour drive away, which is not hard to do, of course, in the DMV, we were doing a lot remote. And I found that, you know, first of all, absolutely, you know, we're built as human beings to have face-to-face interaction. You know, it's just easier to communicate that way. That said, you know, there are obviously the advantages of virtual are tremendous. We've just found that we've had to, sure, we are all learning this. You just have to be a lot more intentional about things that just happened organically before. You know, just like in our office, like we have to be intentional about when we're communicating with each other, because you know, you don't have the automatic water cooler talk that you do in the office. So it'll just be interesting to see how that continues. You were just kind of addressing exactly that, Robin. You know, like it just, as human beings, like, you know, our chassis was developed however many millions of years ago when we were face to face with each other. And that's how we do a lot of our communicating, and replacing that is sometimes easier said than done.
And let me just pick up on that for just a second.
Sure,
like
absolutely.
It's for intentionality. Yeah. Like I used to be able to just, you know, oh, we're going to talk about this today. Let me get my handouts ready. And now, you know, instead of like handing someone a piece of paper and we're all going to kind of read this together, it's like, let me share my screen with you. And so just like, and also there's like, when you share your screen, sometimes clinicians will share the whole screen, and that can be distracting if the client is on the other end saying like, hang on a second, what is that?
Right.
What does that bookmark mean? You know?
Right.
So yeah, it's just different. You know, you do have to kind of, you know, I mean, not that one is coming to session unprepared anyway, but you're preparing in a different way, I guess, you know, in terms of how you share stuff and, you know, what's being asked in the session. So, yeah.
Well, my question to you is this, and again, you may have two different pieces of advice pre and post COVID, but the question is this: what is your number one best piece of advice for navigating life as a working parent?
Yeah, I mean, my answer is going to be influenced by the kick that I've been on in the last 6 months, or maybe more than 6 months, which is compassion. And, you know, we may have spoken about this before. I mean, you know, compassion is, you know, wanting to help someone when they're suffering, and a commitment to being with someone, to be with someone when they're suffering. And I would actually start with self-compassion. And I think that's easily overlooked when there's a focus on helping others, when there's a focus on others are causing problems for me, whatever the focus may be. One of the, I don't want to call it a blind spot, but just easily overlooked ways that we can relate to ourselves is to be compassionate in the moment, to be aware that, we're all going through difficult times in different ways. COVID is one thing, but just, take the pandemic and, add on 6 other stressors. Your brother gets diagnosed with cancer, or you're in the middle of a divorce, or you just moved, or you got laid off. It's just innumerable other factors that are stressors, And so when things get hard, especially I'll invoke the parent identity here, especially as a parent, your ability to show up in that role and function properly as defined by your own values and expectations, your role is helped. How you show up to that role is helped by your grace and your patience and your compassion for yourself and for others. So yeah, there's many ways I could sort of expand on that, but to keep it short, which is very hard for me to do, as if you haven't gathered by now, is compassion. So I would start with that. The ability to get lost in stressful thinking and judgmental thinking and negative thinking, the ability to wake up from that and, relate to yourself in a kind and compassionate way that would be my gold medal answer. That's the number one thing I would impart, really.
Yeah, so profound. I think that's, a lot of food for thought there. And then I don't know if you have my next question was, is there a book or an article that you found particularly either now or when you were first becoming a parent that you would recommend to folks?
Well, the books, so for me as a dad, there's a book called The Expectant Father. So this would be when you find out that you are going to be a dad. The Expectant Father by Armin Brott, I don't know how to say that, and Jennifer Ash. That was really a win. I loved that book.
My husband loved that book too. He just recently sent it to his youngest brother who was expecting a baby. So I've seen it recently.
So that's one that I recommend couples is And Baby Makes Three, which was written by John and Julie Schwartz Gottman. And that's basically like the Gottmans are, powerhouse figures in the field of marriage and family therapy. The Gottman Institute researches thousands of couples and has developed Gottman method couples therapy. So it's essentially one of his big books is the 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work. Okay, but that's not necessarily the book I'm recommending. The book I'm recommending is And Baby Makes Three, which is essentially the tenets of the 7 Principles book as applied to the stage of life of transitioning to parenthood. So it speaks exactly to what's important for couples to consider in terms of their functioning and how they make the transition, as well as once baby comes, considerations for preserving the functioning of the relationship, because it's highly stressful. And 2/3 of couples who become new parents don't navigate that transition very successfully. That's kind of normal to not navigate it successfully. So there's a lot of great information in that book, And Baby Makes Three. There's not another text that comes to mind, although I know if I had my resources list, I'd be able to share more. And maybe I could do that afterwards if you want to put that in the show notes.
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be great. We'll put those 2 books in the show notes and whatever else you want to send us. And then my final question is, how about a piece of technology? Is there one that you use in particular to kind of help navigate working with children? Which again has probably changed after COVID. There are a lot of technologies to rely on now, but anything that would be sort of your number one.
Well, maybe let me have you sharpen that up a little bit. What do you mean by working with children? So you're talking about as a professional or?
No, it doesn't have to be as a professional.
Oh, just so as a dad.
As a dad.
Technology.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I would say the piece of technology that was most appreciated, I think it was my aunt and uncle got us the standing swing where, put baby in the swing and turn the swing on, and it has music and it has sort of like, what are those, the mobile spinning around. And
what did we do before those, right?
Yeah. That was really, really helpful. So, like we talk about like baby monitors or other technology. Honestly, I don't know. This is my personal preference that I joke with my wife and I call us like the Flanders, like Ned and Maud Flanders in terms of the way that we like restrict sugar and restrict screen time and all this stuff. So with technology, there's the thing I just associate to is the baby swing. That was like the best thing that helped when in those first 12 months.
Oh, absolutely. Are there any apps or anything like that you and your wife use? It could be anything like grocery shopping, like something that you that really kind of helped the wheels turn?
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking back 4 years now, or 5 years.
Or it could even be now. It doesn't have to be anything that you use that as a working parent, you'd have trouble getting by without.
Well, I mean, yeah, I'll tell you, this again sort of rises above the identity of a parent, but just having an organizer. So like I'm thinking, my wife is kind of point person on ordering groceries, and I don't know Instacart. I don't even know. Like, I'm outside of that world. I would rather just I'll put on my mask and I'll go pick up the groceries. But yeah, I would say having an organizer, that's one of the most useful pieces of technology or application. I mean, and this is not technology. You can have an organizer that's paper, frankly.
Sure.
But what I do is I've actually really leveraged what Google's engineers have allowed, which is my calendar, my planner has chunks of block time. And then each of those, if there's relevant links or resources, there are hyperlinks that go into a document that might be very complicated, and there's a table of context with hyperlinked things. So in terms of organization and access to information and coordination, cooperation, that a shared calendar where you can have access to information without necessarily, being in the same place, even though we're in lockdown, and a lot of us are in the same place a lot of the times.
Right.
That's really helpful to stay on top of things, stay on top of doctor's appointments and bills. And I would point to my organizer, I use Google Calendar, and it's very helpful to, link to other things that you might need to reference that I can store in Google Drive.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And, sort of what we are all becoming used to, whether we like it or not, and particularly if we're talking about kids getting ready to go back to school, asynchronous communication, right? Asynchronous instruction. It's like I've never used that word so much. In any event, well, Robin, thanks so much. That's the last of my questions. Now we'll turn it back over to you, Lori, to end us out.
Great. Thank you so much for being with us today, Robin. I really enjoyed our conversation, learned a lot, and got some great perspectives here.
Well, likewise.
Great. Thanks for joining us. Everyone, please stay tuned for our next episodes of the Parents at Work podcast. We're going to turn next to some moms and dads who are engineers and do a separate podcast with moms and separate podcast with dad engineers. Look forward to having you back at that point. If you enjoyed the podcast, we'd love if you would leave a review and rate it on all the places that one finds the Parents at Work podcast. And please share a link with a friend. If you know a dad therapist who might benefit from hearing the wisdom of Robin and being able to, connect with another dad in the mental health profession, please go ahead and share this episode with him. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back next time.